Our first discussion today looked at an assessment of the current state of play and the major challenges for US national security from a global terrorism perspective. I now want to bring our focus to America's current domestic extremism landscape. Domestic terrorism in the United States today is a more serious threat than it has ever been. And that includes when we compare it to the 90s, a decade in which Americans experienced Ruby Ridge in 1992 and Waco, Texas in 1993, and the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. More recently, America has seen its fair share of violence committed by domestic violent extremists. From Pittsburgh to Poway and El Paso to Charlottesville, domestic violent extremism plagues the United States on a regular basis. Today, the threat is also more diverse than it has ever been, with formal organizations like the Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, and Proud Boys, as well as lone actors or individuals and movements like the Boogaloo Boys and QAnon conspiracy theorists, all operating at once. Further, because the United States has spent the past 2 decades almost singularly focused on the threat posed by the so-called Salafi jihadism, the government and federal law enforcement have been caught flat-footed in responding to domestic violent extremism. And I'm not alone in this assessment. At the international level, a 2020 United Nations report noted a 320% rise in far-right attacks globally in the last 5 years. The report emphasizes the transnational nature of this threat. And closer to home, our Department of Homeland Security assessed last year that white supremacist extremists will remain the deadliest domestic terror threat to the United States. In addition, according to the FBI Director, Christopher Wray, over the past 2 years, the number of domestic terrorism investigations being pursued by the FBI have increased from 850 cases to approximately 2,000 cases. So let us look more closely at extremism in America, in particular, the rise of violence instigated by white supremacist and racially and ethnically motivated groups, by far-right extremists, by anti-government militias, and conspiracy theorists. The culmination of this violence was most dramatically illustrated by the insurrection on January 6, 2021 in Washington, D.C., during the storming of the US Capitol building, but built on an increased momentum among domestic violent extremists. Although that insurrection was unsuccessful in attaining its objectives, far-right violent groups have lauded the effort and seen in the attempt the seeds of future successes. The symbolism of this day will resonate with domestic extremists and even potentially inspired groups overseas seeking to challenge their own system and their own governments. It's clear that those attacking the Capitol on January 6 did not expect law enforcement to react in the manner expected against other groups and other ideological movements. There is no question that in the United States, we have a double standard in terms of how we view the threat. But above all of this, in the United States, the double standard with respect to terrorism and how it's treated resides in our own legal realm. The United States does not have a domestic terrorism statute, nothing equivalent to the way that the United States can designate foreign terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. At present, there seems to be little political will on both sides of the aisle to change this. But in some corners of the counterterrorism communities, we are seeing calls for a DT statute begin to gain traction. In countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, or many Western countries and allies, federal law enforcement and intelligence community do not have firewalls between domestic and international terrorism. In the United States, on the other hand, there is no serious punishment associated with charges for domestic terrorism. The case of Christopher Hayson is indicative of this current dysfunction with which the United States government approaches domestic terrorism. Hayson was a U.S. Coast Guard lieutenant who, in his own words, wanted to start a race war. While publicly calling Hayson a domestic terrorist, federal prosecutors were unable to charge him with any terrorism-related offenses. Hayson's writings left no questions over his intentions or the ideology he subscribed to, yet the authorities were still limited in how they could charge him due to the lack of an effective domestic terrorism statute. This is a glaring blind spot in current United States laws. White supremacists and other domestic violent extremists fall into the seams created by law and policy. This puts the United States at a significant strategic disadvantage in responding to this urgent and growing threat. Our country today is managing a diverse domestic violent extremism landscape, and a particularly concerning commonality among the most extreme actors is adherence to an ideology known as accelerationism. Accelerationism views violence and terrorism not only as a necessity, but also as a desirable mean to bring about the collapse of the current state of government, our government. We see today groups in America like the Base and the Atomwaffen Division and their offshoots promote this violent ideology. Another concerning area is the widespread circulation of disinformation and conspiracy theories. The widespread disinformation campaigns about things that surround us every day. Things like COVID-19, things like 5G technology, things like vaccination, things like wearing masks. All these things may give rise to more violent anti-government movements, splinters, or offshoots. All these conspiracies is leading into this. And in a climate where we see young people spending increasingly more time online, violent extremist groups across the ideological spectrum have further opportunities to spread their narratives, to recruit, and to mobilize. I must highlight today another concerning element in our domestic extremism landscape, which is the growing challenge of so-called salad bar ideologies. We are seeing more and more today extremists with an assortment of grievances. This development, combined with decentralized and diffused movements, present a particular difficult security challenge. Further, there are important connectors that facilitate this ideological convergence, including nihilism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, and accelerationism. For example, the Boogaloo movement we witnessed last year, they were everywhere, evolved from meme culture and is emblematic of the difficulties of neatly labeling the current crop of domestic violent extremist actors in the United States. The movement is primarily anti-government and anti-law enforcement, and it has a predominantly far-right posture, but some element of the Boogaloo movement have also attempted to position themselves as an anti-racist movement. You know, the global war on terrorism, for all of its fault, brought to bear the military might of the world's most powerful nation and focused it on disrupting and dismantling organizations and groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, motivated by a specific ideology, Salafi jihadism. This led to many tactical victories. However, today in America, the onus is now on law enforcement and the intelligence community to adjust to a complex operating environment where individuals and movements are just as threatening as groups and organizations. And these individuals and movements are motivated by a set of grievances and ideologies that may seem unfamiliar and even absurd, especially when one considers the threat posed by conspiracies like QAnon or young men known as incel willing to kill because they are unable to find romantic partners. The challenge will be for policymakers, practitioners, and counterterrorism analysts to step outside of their analytical comfort zone and question long-standing assumptions that may be flawed or altogether outdated, and consider if and how the counterterrorism frameworks that have been established over the past 2 decades are fit for purpose in the current operating environment. And from all of this, we must consider the impact of America's domestic violent extremism challenge and our country's standing in the world. America's closest allies across the world have looked on at recent events here in the United States, most notably the attack on the US Capitol on January 6th, with disbelief, with disappointment, with utter shock. Our global leadership role has been in question for several years now, especially following political and moral failure in the global war on terror. Recent events and attacks make it much more difficult for the United States to effectively lead and promote democratic values on a global stage. Worse, America's adversaries have been able to successfully exploit these events, and they are celebrating the damage to our reputation and image. Russia and China in particular have benefited from America's recent decline and therefore influence on the world stage, and will continue to do so. Ultimately, our domestic violent extremism landscape shows our adversaries how vulnerable we are, and in a sense, could embolden adventurism abroad as our competitors see us distracted domestically. And so we must devise a way forward in our discussion on effectively responding to the domestic threat we face as a nation. To begin, we must address the perception challenge. Many Americans, however, belatedly, now do recognize the threat from domestic violent extremism. Also, we need to be more careful about politicizing terrorism and making it a partisan issue. We cannot be seen as a society that applies the law selectively and cherry picks who should be considered a terrorist and who should not be. If you engage in acts of politically and ideologically motivated violence, and you meet the criteria of what a terrorist is, you should be prosecuted as such. Our elected officials, law enforcement, and policy practitioners need to be agnostic to the ideology motivating terrorism and focus on the action of violence. Focus on how to prevent and counter those actions and how to investigate and prosecute those actions. Further, we must recall that our counterterrorism officials are not starting with a blank slate. There are over 2 decades of lessons learned and infrastructure developed. The key imperative will be to ensure these are fit for purpose to address current threats unfolding against a very different national, social, and economic backdrop inside the United States itself. And with that, I conclude this lecture and set up our next discussion on lessons we can learn by addressing some of the similarities between the so-called Salafi jihadism and the white supremacy extremism. Again, thank you for your time.